Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I will be looking at a short story that many of you may be familiar with. This is probably in the syllabus of most colleges and universities in India. This is a famous short story by Catherine Mansfield, The Fly. And I have been meaning to make this video for a very long time. Inspired by a post that was made by a very dear friend of mine, Rahul Roy, who teaches at the St. Xavier's St. Xavier's University in Calcutta. And before I start the video, I would wish to mention another friend of mine, Proshun Banerjee, who teaches at the Department of English, St. Xavier's College, North Bengal, because Proshun pointed out to me that I had got the pronunciation of a German word wrong. So this is my opportunity to set that right. He's absolutely right. The pronunciation should be Spaltung instead of Spaltung. So I had said Spaltung, which was wrong. It should be Spaltung. So thank you, Proshun, for pointing that out to me. And thank you, Proyag, for inspiring me to make this video. I had read The Fly many years ago when I was doing my UG, which was hundreds of years ago. And I had forgotten about it. It had made a very big impression on me. I remember being extremely troubled by the way in which the fly is killed. I remember being absolutely horrified by the cruelty of this man. And I was really surprised by the casual nature of the killing, the way in which, you know, the drops of ink were dropped on the fly, and the fly tried to recover, and the fly failed to recover, and the fly was thrown away. And at that time, of course, I wasn't aware, because in India it hadn't reached as yet, of the discipline of masculinity studies. I wasn't aware, I was certainly aware of feminism, but I was not aware of masculinity studies. But over the last few years, since I have been thinking about masculinity studies, reading on masculinity studies, I have been looking at literature, usually texts that I have read in my UG days or even in my PG days. And I've been looking at those texts, and I have been trying to figure out exactly how do men work in these texts. You can say that this is not particularly necessary. No, but it is actually necessary. So here is the question. Before I actually go into the short story, here is the question. How does one do masculinity studies when it comes to literature, right? How does one operate? I think obviously there are theories available, and I'm not going to talk about the theories of masculinity studies over here, because that would make it incredibly boring. There are certainly people who have worked on it, like Todd Reeser, like R.W. Connell, like Michael Kimmel. So these are all in India. We've got Sanjay Srivastava, you've got Mangesh Kulkarni, you've got Rahul Roy. So there are all these names that obviously you can look up on Google after you've watched the video. I'm not going to talk about that aspect as such. What I really intend to talk about is how does one use masculinity studies to look at literature. I'm sure there may be many ways of looking at it, but my way of looking at masculinity studies and by looking at literature through masculinity studies is to ask a very simple question, which is, when a character is working, when a male character is working, how much of his actions or how much of his thoughts or how many of his words are influenced consciously or unconsciously by his awareness of being a man. That is to say, how much does he believe in what society has constructed as masculinity? So if we can just keep that one question in mind, how does an author show through his word or through his deed or through his thought his masculinity, that is to say, how much does he believe in the social construction of masculinity. That, I think, is a fairly good clue as to understanding how this person is operating. And when I use masculinity studies on the short story The Fly, it is stunning how productive that reading turns out to be. Now, masculinity studies is also very much predicated on a certain post-structuralist way of thinking, right? Which is to say that masculinity studies, to a certain extent, exposes a binary and then tells you that this binary is untenable. And there are several binaries. It's not just one binary. There are several binaries on which masculinity is predicated. The most obvious binary, that which we all recognize, is of course male and female. I'm a man because you're a woman. I'm a man because I'm not a woman. That is the most obvious binary. But then there are so many other binaries. You may have heard of the expression, this will separate the boys from the men, right? So therefore, when it is being said that this will separate the boys from the men, the boys therefore are being attributed no masculinity. So the boys are not male, it is the men who are suitably male. So there is some kind of an adulthood that is automatically associated with masculinity. So the men are adults. And if you're not an adult, then you are a boy. You're infantilized, right? So therefore you are a boy. You are a woman. Yes. So therefore, aste ladies bacha kole. So therefore there is a way in which the bacha becomes infantilized, in the same way that in a patriarchal society, women are infantilized. Yeah. So therefore, when you talking about, this will separate the boys from the men, you are basically saying that the boys haven't yet acquired masculinity. This is something that they must acquire. Yes, you have to go through trials, you have to go through tribulations, yeah, and that is when you acquire masculinity. So keeping all of this in mind, I went to the short story, and it was astonishing what the reading of the short story revealed. I had read it so many years ago, I had forgotten so much of it. And when I went back to it, it struck me that right at the beginning of the short story, you have that binary that is being, I'm not going to say created, but drawn attention to. Because I don't know whether Katherine Mansfield believed in the binary of the boy and the man, but that is certainly something that becomes very clear in the short story. Because you see, Woodyfield, when he is described sitting in that chair, you remember very well, opposite the desk from the boss, what is the word that is used to describe Woodyfield? Baby. He's called a baby. And very soon afterwards, the narrator tells us that he is under the control of his wife and daughters. So look at the way in which Woodyfield is being constructed as, somebody with inadequate masculinity. Remember, this short story is being written by a woman, right? So therefore one has to be very, very careful about thinking that, oh, maybe that is what Katherine Mansfield herself believes in. No, maybe she's taking a very, very critical distance. Maybe she is actually looking at masculinity in this incredibly remarkable way. So you've got Woodyfield, who is described as a baby, and we are also told that he is basically under the thumb of his wife and daughters. So what do we get to know about Woodyfield? That he is a baby, so he has inadequate masculinity, or he has no masculinity, and the fact that he is ruled by his wife and daughters, which means that this further exacerbates, the lack of masculinity that he has. Now let us contrast this with the boss. at the helm is the term that Catherine Mansfield uses. The boss is at the helm. And Woody Field, so if we are going to think about masculinity as comprising three levels, yeah, so you've got hegemonic masculinity, you've got complicit masculinity, and you've got subordinate masculinity. So you can certainly say that the boss is completely an embodiment of hegemonic masculinity. He's at the helm, the way in which men should be at the helm. And you have Woody Field, who perhaps belongs to complicit masculinity. That is to say, he does not have masculinity himself, but he certainly supports it, because he says, oh, it is snug in here. So this is the kind of masculine environment that Woody Field perhaps aspires to, but he knows that he will never have it. Yes, and it is the boss who makes him aware of the fact that he's never going to have that masculine sense of authority. Yes, the upholstery, the chairs, the furniture. And Catherine Mansfield also reminds us that Woody Field is a frail, old figure. So if Woody Field is a frail, old figure, look at the way in which Catherine Mansfield, through her use of adjectives, is creating Woody Field in the image of the inadequately masculine. He's a baby, he's frail, he's old, and most criminally, most unforgivably, he is under the control of his wife and daughters. So clearly, everything that a true man shouldn't be. And then we introduce another kind of masculinity, but this is a very, very still masculinity, because this masculinity is made available to us through a photograph. This, of course, is the photograph of the son of the boss. It's a very staged photograph, right? And I think it is very important. It's very important that when the boss looks at the photograph, he says that, my son wasn't like this. No, of course your son wasn't like this. It is very clear for us to figure out that the son of the boss was forced into a life that perhaps the young man did not want. So therefore, the boss's son was very much a victim of the kind of pressure that society brings to bear on young men. In that photograph, you have the image of a victim of patriarchy, yeah, because the son is clearly a victim of patriarchy. And then the boss, of course, goes on to show power, he goes on to show wealth, because you remember he brings out that bottle of whiskey, and he says that, oh, if you promise not to tell anyone, I'm going to tell you that this whiskey comes from the cellars of Windsor Castle. Very important for us to remember that Windsor Castle, what does Windsor Castle, what does it communicate? Windsor Castle, of course, is the oldest castle that is used by the British royal family. So if we are talking about Windsor Castle, we are also talking about a certain extremely patriarchal kind of setup. And the boss says that, oh, this is where the whiskey comes from. Also, you must understand that Windsor is regarded as a very British name, and the British royal family acquired the name of Windsor only during the First World War, when King George V realized that if they continued to retain their surname, which was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which was a German surname, then a lot of the British people may actually start to suspect that their royal family has got German inclinations, or that they're somehow favorably disposed towards the German. So in order to create a sense of Britishness, in order to reposition themselves as being properly British. Oh, we are not Germans. Of course they are. But to say that, oh, we are not Germans, we are as British as Windsor. So there is a way in which patriotism, yes, was created by a very patriarchal man, George V, and he used the word Windsor to do it. So when he says that the whiskey comes from Windsor Castle, she is also invoking, Catherine Mansfield is also invoking a very, very patriarchal tradition of the way in which naming happens and the way in which naming is used to consolidate patriarchy. And he says something very, very interesting. Of course, this I think is very much, I would personally say that if anybody is doing masculinity studies work on the fly, this line, of course, is a dead giveaway. He says, the boss says, of course, we know a bit more than the ladies. Oh yes, we know a bit more than the ladies. So therefore, this is where we know, right? We have more knowledge. So therefore, this whole idea of knowledge being male and ignorance being female, yes? So therefore, all women are stupid, all men are intelligent, that completely sort of patriarchal nonsense is something that the boss clearly believes in. Oh, we know a bit more than the ladies. And then, of course, we come to the horrible part where the boss actually, rescues the fly from the ink bottle, puts it on a blotting paper, allows that fly to dry, and then keeps on dropping, little drops of ink till the fly can't survive that onslaught of ink drops anymore. By which time, of course, the woody field has left. Why does the boss do it? Well, the boss does it because that is an act which is very, very easily understandable as the one through which boss is trying to sort of test the fly as to how masculine the fly is. That is what is being done. The fly, of course, as you can imagine, is not interested in gender. The fly is not interested in proving his their masculinity or their femininity or whatever. The fly is simply interested to live. But the boss, he has to see the fly succeed in proving its masculinity. And according to the boss, the way in which you prove your masculinity is that you soldier on. Yes, you keep on keeping on. And that is the way in which you prove that you're a man. Now, why is the boss doing this? The boss is doing this because you remember that after his son is mentioned, after the son's grave is mentioned, the boss is completely shattered inside. He's very troubled. And he realizes that he hasn't mourned his son's passing in the war. So the loss of the son is something that the boss is very, very troubled by. Now, this is where I think we will have to pause a little bit and to understand exactly what is the nature of the boss's grief. Part of that grief may be that the boss is obviously losing somebody that he loved. But that is not the whole story. In losing the boy, the boss also lost that very patriarchal thing, somebody to continue his business, somebody to inherit the property, right? So therefore, the son was of value to the boss, not as a human being. The son was of value to the boss as somebody who is going to continue the boss's legacy. So the boss loved his son for purely selfish reasons. So therefore, I'm not terribly sure whether it was love at all. So in dying, the boy seems to have actually tricked the boss. Through death, the son seems to have told the boss, I will not be a part of your game. I will not take on your business. This is something that I refuse to do. So what is really happening over there is when the boss thinks that he wants to cry, as you know very well, it says over there, he wanted, he intended, he arranged to weep. He arranges to weep, but of course he can't weep. And he can't weep because of various reasons. First of all, he can't weep because his grief is not entirely genuine. That is the one reason why he can't weep. But the second reason why he can't weep is because he has taught himself that emotional repression is a sign of masculinity. And now he actually envies Woodyfield. He doesn't admit it, but he actually envies Woodyfield because Woodyfield is, in spite of his being a baby, in spite of being frail, in spite of being old, Woodyfield is in touch with his emotions, which is something that the boss is incapable of doing. Which is why when the boss actually starts to, when he arranges to weep, he can't weep. Because the repression has become so solidified, it has become so deeply embedded that he cannot weep. And then of course the fly episode happens, and when the fly fails, the boss throws away the fly. Now the throwing away of the fly is also, the boss performing his contempt for a creature who has not succeeded in overcoming adversity. Because the boss prides himself on overcoming adversity. What the boss perhaps realizes, but then again he capitulates, he returns back to his old self. He realizes that this overcoming of adversity has come to him at a great price. It has been a very, very expensive overcoming. He realizes that. But now, of course, it's too late. So rather than admit to himself that in spite of his very posh office and his whiskey from the cellars of Windsor Castle, the boss is actually a failure as a human being, rather than admit to that, the boss throws away the fly. And by throwing away the fly, the boss again sort of re-establishes for himself the masculinity that had cracked a little bit in the presence of Woodyfield. Not in the presence of Woodyfield, but when Woodyfield had mentioned his son's grave. So when we actually look at, and then of course, when he forces those tears, and the tears don't come, it is remarkable what happens, because after the fly has been thrown away, the boss tries to remember what was it that he was intending to cry about, but you remember how the story ends. He could not remember. He could not remember. It's a fantastic story, because what is happening over there is that Katherine Mansfield is showing you through the boss, this is what men become if they believe in masculinity so much. They become so emotionally stunted, they become so emotionally repressed, that even when that repressed emotion threatens to bubble up, they push it down, and after having pushed it down, they tell themselves that they cannot remember what had just bubbled up and what had just been pushed down. They even forget that they are repressed. So a part of being masculine then is to forget your own emotional repression. It's a remarkable story. Anyway, thank you so much for having stayed with me for a discussion of Katherine Mansfield's short story, The Fly, through the prism of masculinity studies. I hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you.